I'm going to spend most of our conversation talking about how Trump shaped the Republican Party, but I want to start because we've just talked to Sarah Churchwell, and she's been talking about these comparisons being made between the Trump rally held at Madison Square Garden recently and fascist rallies held at the same location in the 1930s. I mean, do you think it's fair that these comparisons are being made, that people are calling Trump a fascist?
Specifically, the rallies you're talking about in the 1930s were Nazi ones, and I think that's out of line. That is you have a setting here where you do have a lot of people of color in there. You have a lot of Hasidic Jews who attend that, but there was a lot of disturbing rhetoric at that Madison Square Garden rally from describing the island of Puerto Rico, so U.S. territory, as a trash heap or a floating heap of garbage, to Tucker Carlson characterizing Vice President Kamala Harris as a Samoan, Malaysian, low IQ former California prosecutor. I just think that we can condemn things without going all the way to Nazi, because there are distinct ways in which the Trump movement, and we'll talk about it, is not a Nazi movement. It's a populist movement, and populist movements in America and in many other parts of the world can be very ugly, and that's what you're getting, is the dark side of populism at that rally. I think the Nazi comparison is overwrought.
Let's take out the Nazi comparison. Is it fair to call Trump a fascist?
No, I disagree, only because I think of fascism as something associated with a specific sort of Southern European set of circumstances and movements. And I just think that American political history has its own analogies that are, I think, better to draw from. So, for example, there is a longstanding American populist tradition going back to Andrew Jackson, who's a transformative president, in some ways expanded small d democracy in the United States. He was the founder, alongside Martin Van Buren, of the modern Democratic Party, which makes it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously existing political party in the whole world. But he had this sort of demagogic side, where he was a bully. He could, he had this sense, for example, he inflicted untold miseries upon America's Native American population, but would also speak of himself as the father of the Native Americans. So, and that's, to me, like, that's kind of very Trumpian. So that's all I'm trying to say, is like I try to, because America is unique, and every citizen of every country thinks that theirs is unique, but the American experience has its own models of really bad things that you could refer back to without needing to turn to, like, Italy, or Franco Spain or whatever, because it's just the traditions are very, very different. But yeah, American populism has leader worship, including, by the way, leaders who we now admire. If you look at, for example, there would be like rallies and celebrations of FDR, and there would be, a bust of FDR the size of my apartment being floated down Fifth Avenue. And if you look at that without any context, you're like, wow, that looks a lot like other leaders of the time around the 1930s and 40s. But of course, FDR was a defender of democracy against fascism. So my point is to use specifically American historical reference, including very ugly ones. Like, Jackson was transformative. He was also kind of a vicious bully and one of the, in terms of the treatment of Native Americans, one of the worst that are out there in our history. I think Jackson is a more apt comparison than any kind of Italian despot.
I mean, since Trump first became the Republican nominee before the 2016 election, how has the Republican Party changed, and how has he specifically changed it?
So Trump has changed the Republican Party in several respects. The first is just the base that he's brought into the party. There's been what's called a realignment, a class-based realignment between the two parties. Democrats increasingly represent the professional class, or the managerial class in urban areas. They didn't used to be. They were founded by Andrew Jackson as a party that was a vehicle for small business, farmers and northeastern workers. It is now shifted to being much more of a professional class party, and at the same time, Trump has picked up. Beginning in 2016, he picked up the white working class, and then in 2020 and now in 2024, he's making inroads among working class people of color. So the first thing he's done is brought a new base to the Republican Party. Lots of people, for example, who were Obama to Trump voters. It's probably the most crucial demographic in this election in places like Pennsylvania. These are kind of white ethnic, meaning like Irish, Italian, Polish, etc., Catholics who were working class, who hated George W. Bush. They voted twice for Barack Obama, and then on the third, and then in 2016 they voted for Trump. So that's one way in which he's changed it. I would argue that on the policy front, Trump has actually moved the Republican Party closer to the center. It's actually moderated the party. This was a party that, in its former iteration, was the party of, we're going to cut your entitlements and we're going to send you off to, misbegotten military adventures in the Middle East, plus a lot of evangelical moral hectoring. That was an agenda that increasingly fewer and fewer people found attractive, and it was extreme in some ways. Like, in other words, although it was kind of the establishment center-right agenda, in terms of like what people actually wanted and how it was playing itself out in their lives, it was felt as extreme and undesirable.
It's so interesting to hear you describe Trump as a moderate, that he's bringing the Republicans back to the center, because that's not how he's seen by most people who listen to his speeches, listen to the rhetoric.
Yeah, in some ways he's not, and I'll get into that. So I'm saying only on the substance or policy front, he's he's a throwback to an older tradition in the Republican Party associated with figures like Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, who basically made their peace with the New Deal, with the entitlement state. So Trump, notably, when he first ran in 2015-16, would disagree with all of his conventional Republican rivals by saying, I'm not going to cut your Social Security. I'm not going to raise the age of retirement. That's unusual. For 2 decades or more, Republicans had been saying that we need to impose means testing on Social Security. We need to cut the benefits, et cetera. And he comes around and says, actually, I'm going to keep your benefits the way they are. And the base of the party, or the new base of the party, roared, in cheering him in saying that. He was able to say that the Iraq war was a disaster. And again, the party intellectuals, including myself, I was a Wall Street Journal leader writer based in London at the time. We all gasped that you can't say that. But then it was like something that ordinary people had long concluded the Iraq war was a disaster. And so when he said it, it moved the party to where a lot of people are. He even hinted that he supports some sort of public option in healthcare. He said, I'm not going to let people die on the street. So in that sense, he's moderated the party, the policy sense. So the substance, however, the form of the party, the political vehicle through which these moderate policy ideas have come to be expressed, has become extreme, and disturbingly so, right? So you have the rhetoric that I mentioned about the Madison Square Garden rally. He has brought in an atmosphere of conspiracism to the party. In other words, lots of former, I see the transformation even, at the level of the popular level of people who are, just, believe that the deep state is out to take away their raw milk, and just this kind of bizarre conspiratorial. And of course, the biggest one of all is his really disturbing 2020 election denialism, which led eventually, it helped fuel the January 6th riot, or insurrection, even you want to call it, at the Capitol, at which 6 people died. So it's a paradox in the sense that he was more moderate than what the kind of establishment uniparty, or the center right and center left Democrats had adopted. They all wanted endless free trade, et cetera, which ordinary people didn't want. In that sense, he's moderate, but it somehow took like someone who in other respects is extreme, is odd, is kind of disturbing, to articulate that and sort of barrel through this kind of the orthodoxy that had settled between center right and left Democrats and Republicans.
So if Trump loses, and that is an if at the moment, and he decided to step away from politics, what does that mean for the Republican Party? Because presumably there's not much attraction in stepping away from that popular position, that new base that has been brought to the party.
Yes. So in my essay for the New Statesman, I argue that even if he loses, these kind of structural transformations that we just discussed. So, for example, the realignment of the party's bases, the fact that you now have a lot of, not, it can be overstated, but it's real enough that a lot of working class people, a lot of union households vote for Republican now. That's it. Those are the kinds of trends that don't change easily. And yes, I mean, a new brand of Republicans have learned to how to harness that energy. Some more, I consider a kind of fake populism where they actually are just going back to promoting the same old Republican agenda, but with this kind of veneer of working class populism. But some are, I think, authentically trying to think through what it means to be a working class party, and are reaching out to the labor movement. They're on they want to cap credit card interest rates. They want to reform the big pharma industry and the degree of power it wields over ordinary consumers, et cetera, et cetera. So that trend, I think, will continue. And then you have, I think, the figure of J.D. Vance, who I think people were puzzled why he was picked as Trump's running mate, because he's in some ways he's so Trump-like in some ways, in terms of his vision. And usually what you want to do when you pick a vice presidential nominee is to create contrast. So like something a little bit different that balances out the main nominee at the top of the ticket. But they chose him, and it became clear why at his debate with Governor Tim Walz, the vice presidential debate, the consensus left, right, center was that J.D. Vance won that debate. Just his performance was so kind of lucid, fluid, capable, except for one point in which he was forced to answer, do you think Trump lost 2020? And he was like, I don't want to answer that. We should just move forward. That was a bad moment. But on the whole, his performance was very good. And it sort of, I think a lot of people I talked to, Republican operatives and pundits and so on, said that made it clear that that no matter what, Vance is the inheritor of the MAGA, kind of populist base of the Republican Party,
I mean,
that no one can challenge that heir apparent status.
many people have said that JD Vance says what he needs to do to get on that ticket, that he's changed his mind. I mean, I think you've interviewed JD Vance. In that pivotal position after the election, where do you think he'll remain? Will those MAGA opinions still be held by him?
I do. I think that there are things that JD says where it's like, okay, well, he's just trying to keep Trump happy here by saying that the 2020 elections outcome was dubious. But there are things that are more structural, maybe is not the right word, but they're deeper in his rethinking of his worldview. He comes from this working class, distressed background in Appalachia, the kind of people who were really hurt by neoliberal globalization, by the destruction of American manufacturing, the China trade shock, et cetera, et cetera. And he comes from that. And in 2016, he writes a book where he describes the miseries and dysfunctions of that part of America, but then ends by saying, and the answer is like self-help. These people should just get religion, work harder, stop buying expensive goods and instead save their money, stop wasting their money, so on. But over and to be fair to him, it's been nearly a decade, he's come around to this view that the fact that millions of working class Americans are struggling, the fact that the very term working class has come to be synonymous with opioid addiction, out of wedlock births, dropping out of the labor force altogether, et cetera, that these cannot be just millions and millions of failures of individual virtue on the part of these people, as a kind of conventional Republican narrative would have it, but rather is result of systemic policy issues that need a rethink. Manufacturing revival, industrial policy, et cetera, et cetera. At the level of those deeper ideas, no, I don't think JD Vance will soon abandon that. That's a genuine conversion. On other elements, though, to be sure, just what he quickly says in the moment to both please the MAGA audience, please Trump himself, and get through an interview. Yes, I definitely see kind of modulation and sort of zigzagging quickly left and right to try to get out of a situation. And he does it very well. But again, I think that the deeper worldview where he's come to believe that, yes, the state has a role in making sure the economy works for working class people, I think that's something that's deeply held.
I mean, what seemed really noticeable at the Madison Square Garden rally is that Trump's comments about the enemy from within weren't necessarily the most extreme on that stage. You talked about the comedian talking about Puerto
Yeah.
Rico as an island of trash, Tucker Carlson, and his comments about Kamala Harris. I mean, do you think that if Trump loses, if he decides to step away, that there's a chance that those figures who've grasped onto this popularity that Trump has found could take the Republicans even further to right in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real danger. And if he does lose, by the way, I think this rally will be seen as a pivotal moment of why that happened, because he was doing very well, actually, like gaining in the polls on Kamala. He just had a very simple message: immigration and economy. Really, that was just, and it was kind of working. But then, like, there's a part of the Trumpian movement that cannot resist what I called on Twitter their kind of menagerie of freaks, just this kind of weird podcasters, far right hucksters, and it's just, they cannot help but bring them into the scene. And it was a very self-inflicted wound to bring out these weirdos to say this stuff, when all they could have done, for example, is bring out some typical, like New York City council members who are of the right, or gubernatorial candidates, etc. Like, bring those people out to say normie stuff. We have this phrase, because our elections happen in November. We have this place called the October surprise, and it's usually when the other side, your opposing side, will kind of dig up some expose, some dirt that was supposed to sink your candidacy, and it happens at the 11th hour, when you can't do much about it at that point. But the odd thing is, I think Donald Trump and his team, by like indulging the online weird right, has maybe mounted an October surprise against their own side, with this MSG rally, which was, by all accounts, was a wreck. Now, I met people who've been to it who are diehard Trumpians, and they're like, no, it was so great, it was so wonderful. I'm like, well, but there's like a wider country. There are like 500,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania alone. There are hundreds of thousands more Puerto Rican Americans who are stretched across the battleground states, and those people, you know, they that, especially that phrase, like it's an island of garbage, etc. That's going to hurt with them.
So where does this leave the Republican Party? Because you're torn by all these different factors. You don't want to lose that popularity. You're engaging with this sort of certain group of people, the weirdos, as you call them, or the freaks, but you don't want them to pull you too far away from that base. In the meantime, you've got a two-party system that doesn't really allow for a spin-off, and so you've got to keep everyone within your party happy. Where does that leave you? Where do you go after Trump?
Yes. Oh, well, we say after Trump as though he's bound to lose, but it's really, I have no idea. It's so close, that I've long learned not to sort of predict what election voters will do. It's just it's so difficult. But um, it it will just be this messy, raucous thing. Both parties are, but especially the Republican Party under Trump is just this messy creature of, you have, like I said, the weird right, the Tuckers of the world and the mini Tuckers. Then you have the conventional Republican Party that's still there, like basically still wants the same old agenda. You have a working class base that is diverse, and more diverse than the Republican Party has had ever. That it's worth noting that. And you have a sort of the power base of the Republican Party, which lies actually not in that working class. The power base, the people who have the most kind of gravitational pull on the party, are what you might call small and regional capital. So it's like, it's not really, really big business. It's the person who owns a tire distributor chain in a specific region, and they wield a lot of power in the Republican Party, and they're not into the kind of populist pro-working class agenda. There tend to be, of all the various segments of American capital, they're the ones who are least interested in making, to like restoring the New Deal order, or having, they believe in like 19th century style competitive capitalism. And that's going to be a part of the picture too. And so as the Republican Party tries to, under Trump or even post-Trump, tries to accommodate a new working class or lower middle class base, it has to find a way to like balance these various interests. And then on top of it all will be, at the level of ideology, will be the freak show of the Donald Trumps and the RFK Juniors with his like vaccine paranoia and stuff like that. It's just going to be messy, is the best I can say.
It's just basically it's Donald Trump as a personable figure, as a figure of charisma that's holding that really delicate sort of fragmented groups of people together at the moment, I
Yes,
suppose,
I
and
mean it's
it
like
could so easily crumble.
yes, I mean he kind of glues over so many internal contradictions. It's remarkable. You have a figure like Elon Musk, who's obviously very secular, going to evangelical mega churches in Pennsylvania and you know talking about Christianity. It just you have this kind of tech
I mean,
bro
would
libertarian.
JD Vance have any possibility of trying to hold that union together?
That's a really good question. I mean, he has enormous political talent that everyone now recognizes. And I say it's like people on the left will grant that, Democratic pundits, like um, he's very, very smooth in interviews. He's very nimble, and he's a deep thinker. He's a guy who reads the stuff that people like you and I write. In a way that like is not true of a lot of politicians. It's, if you, especially American politicians, at the very least, I'll say that I don't know about Westminster, but like if you meet the average member of Congress, they're just so not up on intellectual debates, and JD Vance is. So all those talents, I'm saying, will go a long way. However, without the figure of Trump, and you will have the status quo the ancien regime of the Republican Party. They'll try to mount a takeover to, push this kind of populist stuff out for good and ill. So you know, Vance is the inheritor of the MAGA base. He's their man now because he's received the nod from the MAGA king himself. But there will be challengers, and it will be a contest. And even if they go into government, you'll have the same thing. So, for example, you'll have people who are on board with like the tariff agenda and industrial policy, things like that, decoupling from China. But you also will continue to have Republican free traders, and so you'll have this kind of push and pull. To be fair, that's also kind of transpiring on the Democrat side, as you know. For example, there's this group of economic reformers that are very closely associated with the Biden administration. People like the Lena Khan, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, or Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative. These are kind of trying to rethink the neoliberal model on the left, but they do face opposition from the more kind of conventionally neoliberal oligarchic wing of the Democrats. So, as I write in that essay, it for good and much ill, American political parties, there are just these two giant formations, unlike many other Western developed multi-party democracies where you have like the Greens, the left, the center left, the populists. You don't have that in the US. You have just two big formations, and all these, here comes everybody. Everyone has to try to muscle their way through cajoling, through bargaining, etc., to try to get what they want out of the big apparatus of either the Democrats or the Republicans.